Good morning. I'm Savannah Sellers.
I'm Joe Fryer. Right now on Morning News Now, progress toward peace after yet another round of high-stakes diplomatic talks yesterday. Ukrainian officials report that they're making headway with Russia to curtail the violence that has plagued their country for more than a month. Moscow now says it'll scale back military activity near Kyiv, but President Biden remains skeptical over Russia's willingness to hold up its end of the bargain.
We'll see if they follow through on what they're suggesting, and we're going to continue to keep a close eye on what's going on.
All this as more than 4 million Ukrainians are forced to seek refuge in other parts of the world. We have team coverage this morning. Round two, some promising developments on the COVID front on this Wednesday morning. Both the FDA and CDC have just given the okay to a second booster shot from Pfizer and Moderna. We'll tell you who's eligible as the latest Omicron subvariant becomes the most dominant strain of the virus here in the U.S. Also this morning, under review, the growing fallout surrounding that smack scene round the world. Will Smith now under scrutiny by the Academy's Board of Governors, who are reportedly set to meet today over the now viral incident. So what sort of consequences could the Oscar-winning actor face? We've got the latest. And the sky's the limit. A pandemic slowdown is giving America's airports the chance to speed up some long overdue renovations. We're bringing you a behind-the-scenes look at Delta's state-of-the-art terminal at LAX just in time for what's sure to be one of the busiest travel seasons in modern history. I feel like anytime I go to an airport right now, it's under construction.
And especially at the New York ones, that means walking like 3 miles to get to your gate. And you're like, is this a psych experiment? Exactly. That's how I feel.
I'm sure they're going to fix all that. All right.
Exactly.
We're going to begin this hour in Ukraine and a claim by the country's military that Russia's pledge to scale back its military activity in some cities is, quote, misleading.
Yeah, that's as the governor of Chernihiv, one of the cities where Russia said it would rein in its offensive, said there had been, quote, no let-up in attacks overnight. NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel reports from the eastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv.
Ukraine accuses Russia this morning of playing a trick, saying Russian promises after negotiations in Istanbul to drastically reduce military activity around Kyiv and the nearby city of Chernihiv is merely a ploy for time to rearm and consolidate forces. President Zelensky saying Ukraine isn't letting its guard down. The signals we hear from the negotiations can be called positive, he says, but they do not drown out the explosions of Russian shells, adding Ukraine isn't willing to surrender any territory to Russia. Promises also can't drown out what Russia is doing to the city of Mariupol. New satellite images show how Russian strikes have leveled entire blocks. The Pentagon also expressing deep skepticism about Russia's supposed trust-building withdrawals around Kyiv.
We're not prepared to call this a retreat or even a withdrawal.
Russia invaded Ukraine over a month ago from 3 directions. From the north, down from Belarus toward Kyiv, from the east toward Kharkiv, and from the south toward Mariupol. Russia's northern front around Kyiv has been a disaster. Huge Russian losses and logistical failures, including a 40-mile-long convoy that ran out of gas. The Pentagon believes Russia could now focus on the other fronts while rebuilding forces around Kyiv.
This was a Russian position. You can see the Z that has become the mark of this war on the Russian armored vehicle. And it seems that they were destroyed just as they were camping out in this area. You can see all of their equipment, clothing, flak jackets and food just left here right at the back of this armored vehicle.
Across Ukraine now, they're not bracing for a Russian ceasefire, not taking the Russians' word, but preparing for more Russian attacks.
Our thanks to Richard Engel for that report.
Now, the refugee crisis in Ukraine has hit another staggering milestone. More than 4 million Ukrainians have now fled the country since Russia's invasion began more than a month ago. And get this, nearly half of those refugees are children, with many of them now cut off from crucial access to basic education. NBC News correspondent Josh Letterman joins us now from a border town in Poland. Josh, good morning. Just tell us, what's the situation like for these children in Poland, and are they able to get back to any type of school, any type of normalcy once they make it there?
Well, Savannah, obviously the most important thing is that these children are out of harm's way and in a safe place. But it's also critically important that, as you mentioned, they have some semblance of normalcy, of stability in their lives, as well as a chance to continue their education so they don't fall behind. And while Polish schools have taken in hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children, they teach in Polish, not in Ukrainian. Other Ukrainian students are learning through Ukrainian schools by Zoom, the way so many American kids did during COVID. But for a lucky few, they're able to attend school in Ukrainian here in Poland, in Ukrainian schools that have just been seeing surging demand. We visited one school this morning. You're seeing some of the students right there. Before the war, they had about 200 students. In just a month, that number has swelled to 1,200 at multiple locations across Warsaw, and they've got 1,000 students on their waiting list right now. And while before the war they charged about $100 per student for parents, now they are not charging anything because so many of these refugees can't afford to pay. And so how are they paying for this? Polish citizens are stepping up with financial support, with volunteering, with food and supplies to make this possible. Some of them are literally walking away from their careers to focus full time on this. And I want you to hear from a Polish lawyer we met this morning. She runs her own law firm, or at least she did. She was in the process of getting a PhD. All of that has gone by the wayside as she focuses full time on helping Ukrainians, including by helping the school. Take a look.
Believe me that I'm not exceptional. Like, you know, all the Poles are doing their best to support the refugees and support Ukrainian people who stay there. So, and like, I just don't feel that I can do nothing more than helping, yes? So right now I completely stopped working commercially and only focus on helping the Ukrainians.
So she has taken in refugees into her home. She has arranged for her friends and family to take in refugees. She's spending every single day volunteering, trying to help. But the big question for these Polish volunteers, Savannah, how long can they keep this up?
Oh, absolutely. Just these individuals. It's just so heartening to see how selfless they are. Josh, we're now getting some signs from the UN that the amount of refugees entering Poland is slowing down from these, massive peaks we saw earlier in March. Are you noticing on the ground that things seem to be slowing down?
Yeah, anecdotally, we are seeing lower numbers than we did at the beginning. And in fact, according to some estimates, there were half as many Ukrainian refugees who fled in the second half of the last 2 weeks of the war than there were in the first 2 weeks. Now, the unanswered question here is this a temporary pause or is this going to be a slowdown that continues as many who want to leave have already left? Others are finding safe places to stay that are elsewhere in Ukraine away from the fighting. But one thing I find really fascinating, we are starting to see small numbers of Ukrainians here in Poland who are making the decision to go back into the war zone with their children. They say Ukraine is their home, and some of them are now heading back, Savannah.
Oh my gosh, wow. Yeah, that's something to definitely keep an eye on, Josh. Now, you just mentioned people kind of moving on from Poland, and we know a lot of countries in Europe and also here the U.S. have set up programs to help relocate these refugees. A lot of them, though, we've had college students on our show here who have just set up a website that a lot of Ukrainians are using. So some of this is really just sort of grassroots. Are these going to be enough to help most of these people leave Poland? They're in Poland because it's a neighboring country. It was the closest place to get to, and now that country's resources are strapped. What now?
Well, exactly. That's the million-dollar question. Will it be enough? For instance, that woman we just heard from, she had 3 refugees staying with her who have now moved on to Italy, where they had some family. At a refugee center that we were at yesterday, they had lists on the wall where you could go and sign up your name on a list if you wanted to be relocated to elsewhere in Poland or a neighboring country. So they are clearly trying to do everything they can to facilitate people moving on to make room for more new coming refugees here in Poland. But again, the numbers are just daunting, Savannah.
Oh, absolutely. All right, Josh Letterman, great reporting. Thank you so much.
Let's talk more about the situation in Ukraine with NBC News Chief International Security and Diplomacy contributor Admiral James Stavridis. Always good to have you with us. So I wanted to start by asking you about that announcement by Russia yesterday that it was scaling back its military operations in Kyiv and Chernihiv. The Russians say this is to increase trust between both sides. The Ukrainians are still highly skeptical, as is much of the West. So what do you make of the move, and do you think we're actually starting to see maybe a new Russian strategy in Ukraine?
Let's start by acknowledging that essentially every statement that's come out of the Kremlin for 6 months has been a lie. They told us again and again and again, oh, we're not going to invade Ukraine. These 200,000 troops are simply doing exercises in a neighboring country, Belarus, and in our own nation in Western Russia. Big pack of lies, and it came from Putin and Sergei Lavrov and the Minister of Defense, Shoigu. Lie, lie, lie. So point one, pretty skeptical given the track record. Point two, to your point, is it a change? I'd say it is as follows. Plan A, which was to blitzkrieg across the country, decapitate the government, put a puppet regime in Kiev, and conquer this neighboring democracy, that's failed, thank God. So now Putin is thinking to himself, okay, what's plan B? And that is moving people back, his military, into the southeast to conduct combat from there.
So let's talk more about the diplomacy. One of the proposals tabled by Ukraine at yesterday's peace talks is that it would remain a neutral country with its security guaranteed by third-party countries. That includes the likes of the U.S., Britain, and France. Those are NATO countries. Do you think that's something Russia would even consider?
I think they're going to have to consider it, Russia will, in order to find a way to achieve what's left of their war aims. So let's face it, what they want to do is consolidate control of kind of a land bridge that would run from Russia down to Crimea. They want acknowledgement that they annexed Crimea and now own it. They will continue to push those positions. To get them, they're going to have to accede to some kind of security guarantee. U.S., Britain, France, good place to start. If you want some non-NATO nations, talk to Finland, talk to Sweden. Highly capable militaries, neutral, not members of NATO. You've got some candidates there.
And then, Admiral, another one of the major sticking points between both sides is Russia's demand that Ukraine recognize the independence of those separatist areas in the eastern Donbass region, as well as the annexation of Crimea. Do you think that's something Ukrainians would accept or compromise on?
At this point, no. President Zelensky has been very clear that he will not cede territory to Russia. But, hey, we're at the pre-negotiation stage, just bringing people together at the table. Over time, I think both sides have an incentive to stop the war and find a solution here. So I'd say over time, it's not inconceivable that there would be some movement on the Ukrainian side in that regard.
Admiral James Stavridis, as always, thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
You bet.
Time now for another check on your Morning News Now weather.
Bill Cairns joins us. Hey, Bill.
Hey, good Wednesday morning on a very active and dangerous weather day, especially in the deep south, and travel trouble and driving in wintry weather from Pennsylvania all the way up through northern Minnesota right now. So this is a classic spring storm with the cold side and the warm side. But the biggest concern, obviously, for life and property will be with severe weather and possible tornadoes later today. We already have a tornado watch that goes out through 1 o'clock Central Daylight Time. There'll be another one that'll be issued later this afternoon in areas east of that. We've had 1 or 2 tornado warnings, especially right around the Oklahoma-Arkansas borders. That's one area that we're watching as this line of storms has now cleared the Dallas area. Austin, San Antonio, you're also in Waco. The line of storms is through you. You are safe. So it's nice once the line goes through and you still have power, then you don't have to worry about it anymore. So here's what's going to happen the rest of today. This is everyone that's at risk of severe storms. Doesn't mean everyone's going to see severe weather, but this is your risk of severe storms. And the brighter the colors, that shows you the higher risk areas, and especially that red moderate risk. That's where we think we could see significant problems. We're thinking widespread wind damage is possible with these storms. Wind gusts 75 miles per hour or higher everywhere from Mississippi through much of Alabama, even the New Orleans area to Baton Rouge, Memphis included in that too. So power outages are a possibility, and we could even see some large hail and strong storms in that area. This is the area at risk for the stronger tornadoes. So that would be an EF2 or higher. Remember, the scale goes from EF0, the weakest, to EF5 is the strongest. So it's pretty much that same area in red there. And what's troublesome about this, we overlaid last week's severe weather. So all the little red icons are where we had tornadoes last week, and the blue is where we had wind damage. Today's threat is almost the exact same location that we had all the severe weather last week. And as far as the winter weather goes, it's not horrible, but we do have problems with snow and ice from State College to Hagerstown to Erie, Pennsylvania. We're even having ice storm warnings for northern Michigan right now. So it's just cold enough for an icy problem. And as far as snow goes, additional snow, maybe enough to shovel from Green Bay up to Marquette, Michigan. And that's the worst of it. So I'm not going to complain about how cold it's been here in the Northeast when everyone else has to deal with this significant mess.
Yeah, we got it easy here right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Bill.
Millions of Americans are now eligible for a second COVID booster shot.
Yeah, the CDC and the FDA have authorized a second booster of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines for people 50 and over and those with underlying health conditions.
The number of Americans who have received their first booster still remains pretty low, with fewer than 50% of those eligible getting that shot. Let's bring in Dr. Bob Lahita. He's a professor at Hackensack Meridian Medical School and director of the Institute for Autoimmune and Rheumatic Diseases at St. Joseph Health, also the author of Immunity Strong. Dr. Bob, good to have you with us. So, experts have been divided on whether another dose, another booster is necessary. So what do you think is behind the FDA and CDC's decision to authorize this second booster, and what should people know about it?
Well, they're telling people over the age of 50 now. Before, last week, it was over the age of 65. The important thing is that you understand that the infection rate is less likely by an order of 2, and the severe illness is less likely by an order of 4. So that's the idea for the booster shot. And a lot of this is based on the Israeli data, which showed that the 48% of the people who got the booster shot were less likely to be super infected and wind up in the hospital and in the ICU. Now, that's what they're suggesting, and that's why we're suggesting, or they are suggesting, a second booster shot.
So, Dr. Bob, you point out it went from 65 to 50. What are the chances that this becomes something that's recommended for all of us, especially as most restrictions have gone away, and now the CDC says the Omicron subvariant, that BA2, is already the most dominant strain in the U.S. Do you think this is going to be recommended for all of us?
I think it's going to be recommended for everyone. We're saying that people that have rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or have cancer and are getting chemotherapy, Pfizer is saying if you're over the age of 12 with those conditions, you can get the booster. Moderna says if you're over 18, you should get the booster. If you're immune compromised, that means that your immune system is not what it should be. So, we're down at 750 deaths per day at this time, which is a grand low for us over the past 2.5 years.
Which is still a frightening number, that we lose 750 people a day, and that's sort of seen as a low number. When it comes to this booster, I feel like this might really be aimed at the people who've already sort of accepted, hey, every 6 months, every year, I'm going to get a shot. That's fine with me. But we have to keep in mind, there are still millions of Americans who haven't received their first booster shot. What do you say to people who may see this news and think, well, what's the point of having to keep going back for another shot?
Well, first of all, Joe, this is going to become an endemic infection, which means that every year we're probably going to have a booster in the fall, along with influenza. That's number one. Secondly, a lot of healthcare facilities, doctors' offices, et cetera, are saying that you have to get the first booster and now the second booster, which is a challenge because my patients are saying, well, I had side effects from the first booster. In fact, I had side effects from the initial vaccine. I am not likely to get a second booster or a fourth shot. So it's a bit of a problem sociologically to try to convince people to get this.
Also, a big question I think some employers are still going to have to answer is, hey, we want you to get that booster. We understand if you have to call out for a day or two.
Yeah.
It's still a discussion we seem to be having.
And I think it calls into question a lot of this about kind of the messaging and communication around it in the first place, because we're all very used to getting the flu shot every year, but something about this being kind of a surprise that we have to keep adding doses has created some confusion, for sure.
We'll see what happens. Yes. Dr. Bob Lahita, as always, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dr. Bob. Good to see you. And coming up on this hour of Morning News Now, the brewing federal funding fight over COVID tests and treatments for America's uninsured.
As of last week, that money has dried up. So how could that affect the nation's healthcare systems if we do see another surge? We're going to take a closer look next.
Welcome back. We told you earlier this hour that federal health officials just authorized a second COVID booster shot for millions of Americans. But the government is already saying it may run out of money to buy enough of those doses. NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard explains.
Now, more than 2 years into this pandemic, the question is about federal funding for COVID care. During the Trump administration, the Biden administration, it was a given, an expectation that the federal government would not only fund COVID treatment, but also pay for the administering of COVID tests and COVID vaccines. But now, up on Capitol Hill, the very question about the future of federal funding is taking place.
As questions about a potential new COVID surge in America linger, the federal government's money to cover the cost of COVID care for uninsured Americans has dried up.
You need to be compensated for the care that you provide. And so this is a risk as we move forward. Hospitals do not have the margin to really absorb this.
The federal emergency relief funds to cover the cost of hospital treatment for uninsured COVID patients, as well as COVID testing, expiring last week.
I would urge the president and Congress to find funds to continue the safety net that's provided to make sure that people have access to care when they need it, so that they can get those boosters, so that they can get testing.
The federal government posting a notice to healthcare providers the last week its COVID-19 uninsured program stopped accepting claims for testing and treatment due to lack of sufficient funds. And coverage for vaccine administration will end next week on April 5th. The federal government saying it will also stop accepting vaccination claims. In the last 2 years, the relief programs have paid healthcare providers $11.3 billion for testing, $5.8 billion for treatment claims, and $1.6 billion for administering vaccines to the uninsured. One of those hospital systems, Valleywise Health in Arizona. It received $3 million in federal money for care and another $700,000 to cover testing expenses.
Many of these folks come in very, very ill and have a long, extended length of hospital stay, and require a lot of resources.
The hospital this week now charging uninsured patients for their treatment and tests.
Do you feel like your hospital system has been put in a tough situation to essentially offer care versus charge because there's a lack of funding coming in from the federal government anymore?
My greatest fear here is we see these funding sources dry up, that people do not have access to things that we know have helped us.
The White House's budget office sent a letter to congressional leaders with a warning that failing to provide additional funding for the COVID response now will leave us unequipped to deal with a future surge.
We're going to continue to use all the resources we have.
The Secretary of Health and Human Services, Javier Becerra, acknowledging the pending challenges.
We're going to stretch where we can, but there's no question if we don't get the resources that we need, we're just going to fall behind. And I don't think at a time when we're turning the page on this fight on COVID that we want to fall behind.
Now, just yesterday, Democratic Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said that he had spoken with Republican Senator Mitt Romney over a potential deal that would allow for essentially the replenishing of these federal funds here to cover the uninsured individuals. But the question is, it was just earlier this month when Democrats were unable to get 10 Republican senators on board as part of a spending package and ultimately stripped out this extra COVID relief funds from the spending package in order to avoid a government shutdown. And that's why the question here in the days ahead is whether the likes of Chuck Schumer is able to get Mitt Romney and at least 9 other Republicans on board in order to replenish those funds.
All right, Vaughn, thank you so much. The number of Americans heading to emergency rooms is on the rise, and those visits are not cheap. One 2017 study found they cost Americans more than $76 billion a year. With big profits like that on the table, an NBC News investigation finds private equity firms are increasingly getting involved. NBC News senior consumer investigative correspondent Vicki Wynn takes a closer look.
Dr. Ray Bravant has dedicated his life to service as an Army surgeon and emergency room doctor.
I took an oath to protect patients to the best I could.
After he left the Army, Bravant took a job as medical director of the ER at Overland Park Regional Medical Center in Kansas. It was 2012, and soon after, he began raising concerns.
I felt that they were prioritizing metrics over quality of care.
He says by 2014, staff was stretched thin when an expansion project doubled the hospital's capacity, and the private equity-backed firm in charge of handling staff refused to add more doctors. It's a growing complaint across the country. Doctors and nurses concerned profits are put ahead of patients as more private equity firms take over healthcare groups. Today, it's estimated over 40% of the nation's emergency departments are overseen by for-profit staffing companies, all of them owned by private equity. These Wall Street firms look for a return on their investments on a shorter timeline, and academic researchers tell us the largest profits are often in the ER.
How does that affect patient safety?
What I was concerned with is having an adequate time to do the job properly. As our volumes grew and the popularity of our ER grew and our responsibilities grew, it became clear to us that my physicians were being asked to be in 3 places at once.
Bravant says that wasn't the only problem. He says doctors and nurses were expected to improve metrics by admitting more patients without adequate exam time or bed space.
You want your doctor to be the advocate for you. And if they have this business interest over their shoulder, they may not be able to make the best decision for you.
Dr. Robert McNamara is the chair of emergency medicine at Temple University. He's also the chief medical officer of a group representing about 8,000 emergency doctors nationwide.
Do you think private equity firms should be in the business of medicine?
Certainly not in emergency medicine. You're having people that are seeking to make a significant profit off of healthcare.
There are laws on the books to prevent the corporate practice of medicine. Are they not being enforced?
No, they're not being enforced.
McNamara says state attorneys general rarely prosecute these types of cases, and doctors often don't speak up for fear of losing their jobs.
And these are billion-dollar companies that you're fighting. You're fighting Wall Street.
Ray Bravant was ultimately fired in 2017 after raising his concerns. By then, the company that controlled his unit staffing was no longer owned by private equity, but by a for-profit publicly traded company. In 2017, he filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against the staffing company's subsidiaries. His former hospital was not named in the suit, and the private equity firm did not respond to NBC News. A year later, the company was back in the hands of another private equity firm. Bravant was eventually awarded $26 million.
I had to be the guy that stepped up and said, this is wrong, but there's a principle behind why I'm doing this.
In a statement to NBC News, the staffing company Envision Healthcare, whose unit employed Bravant and continues to be private equity owned, says in part, Envision is compliant with state laws and operates with high ethical standards that put patients' health and safety first. The concern raised by Dr. Bravant was related to a hospital policy, not an Envision policy, and predates Envision's current leadership team.
I want this system to change. I want people to believe that they can effectively change this system, even though it feels enormous.
That was Vicki Nguyen reporting. More than 30 states have laws against what's known as the corporate practice of medicine, which prohibits for-profit companies from being in charge of medical care. But experts say AGs rarely file such cases.
Now, it was a mid-flight scare for a 28-year-old woman traveling from Newark to Phoenix when her heart stopped beating.
That's when a doctor on his way to a conference sprung into action to perform CPR. NBC News correspondent Kristen Dahlgren has more on what happened.
It was supposed to be a bachelorette weekend in Arizona.
We were really looking forward to it.
But none of them could have predicted what would happen in the air just 2 hours into their trip.
I closed my eyes and went to sleep, and that's the last thing I remember until I woke up and I was like in a stretcher, like by the plane, going into an ambulance.
Brittany Matiro is 28. She works out 3 days a week.
I've never had any like health issues ever, like growing up.
But somewhere between Newark and Phoenix, her heart stopped. Luckily, Dr. Kashif Chaudhry was on his way to a cardiology conference when he heard her friend scream.
I found this woman who was completely unresponsive, slumped over, immediately checked for a pulse. There was no carotid pulse. There was no radial pulse as well. So at this time, at this point, I'm thinking maybe she's having a cardiac arrest.
He and his wife, who is also a doctor, sprung into action. He started CPR.
And about 90 seconds into CPR, she started moving a little bit. When she started moving, checked her pulse quickly, there was a pulse. It was a great pulse.
The plane diverted to Oklahoma City, Dr. Chaudhry's wife holding Brittany's hand.
Of just like a little flash of looking over on the plane and seeing a lady that wasn't my friend, like holding my hand.
According to Dr. Chaudhry, cardiac arrest can happen to anyone, but Brittany's case is unusual. 8% of cases occur in people under 40. Without early intervention, up to 90% of patients die before ever reaching the hospital.
Where would you be if he hadn't been on that plane?
I wouldn't be here, which is so crazy. I got lucky that there was multiple cardiologists on board, but at the end of the day, like, anyone who knew CPR could have helped me.
Almost a month later, Brittany is doing well, still undergoing tests to see what went wrong, but determined to make sure she's ready if it happens to anyone else.
CPR is what saved my life, so I definitely just want to have, it's an easy, quick skill to learn.
So she and her friends are signing up for a class together now, knowing just how important CPR can be. She said she's been talking to everybody she knows, her boss, telling them, learn CPR. Wow. It really could have been anyone on that plane. And on the Today Show, guys, just a few minutes ago, she was able to meet Dr. Chaudhry in person for the first time since the incident. Oh. She says she really doesn't remember him from the plane, so she got to say thank you. It was just such a sweet moment. She's so grateful.
Oh, that's amazing. My mind is just blown that there were doctors on their way to a cardiology conference when this happened. I mean, how amazing is that?
Yeah, and it's not just her and her friends who are going to take CPR classes. I think that story is going to inspire a lot of people to do the same.
Absolutely. Kristen, amazing story. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Coming up, tensions may indeed be ramping up between Russia, the U.S., and the world, but to one American astronaut who spent nearly a year in space with his two Russian counterparts, the camaraderie comes with the territory. Their story as they come back down to Earth.
Plus, the Queen returns to the public eye for the first time in months to honor her late husband, Prince Philip, but the appearance wasn't without controversy. We'll explain that after the break.
This morning, an American astronaut who spent nearly a year in space and two of his Russian counterparts touched down in Kazakhstan. They'd been together on the International Space Station, while here on Earth, Russia and the U.S. have been at odds, to say the least, over the war in Ukraine. NBC News correspondent Sam Brock has more on that. Sam, good morning.
Joe, good morning. What an incredible sight that was, because despite the obvious tensions right now between the United States and Russia and everything else that is going on in the world right now, there is one positive tie binding these two countries together, and that is space. Those three men, Joe, touching down overnight in a remote part of Kazakhstan, this in a Russian Soyuz capsule. All of that going on right now, as it is a reminder of the collaboration and connection that is still possible between these countries.
Thank you very much, my crewmates. We are like my space brothers and space sister.
250 miles above Earth's surface is arguably the only space these days where the U.S. and Russia are still currently finding common ground.
Undocking confirmed.
Overnight, American astronaut Mark Vande Hei leaving the International Space Station after 355 consecutive days in space, a new American record. He returned with two Russian cosmonauts aboard a Russian Soyuz capsule. The return to Earth coming just weeks after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, prompting global condemnation and crippling sanctions on Russian elites and businesses, including their high-tech and aerospace industries. But tensions on the ground so far have not seemed to undermine camaraderie and commitment to science on the space station.
We have one crew. And I think ISS is like symbol of the friendship and cooperations.
But the head of Russia's space agency, Putin ally Dmitry Rogozin, has inflamed relations with threats, recently suggesting Russia could let the space station crash down to Earth. That prompted former space station commander Scott Kelly to strike back on Twitter before heeding NASA's pleas not to fan the flames.
Can astronauts separate the two, what's happening in the world, with relying on one another for survival?
When you're in space, you recognize you're here, there's Earth. We have stuff that's important to us, and that is, our emotional support, our friendship, working together, but also literally, relying on each other for our lives.
NASA's dependency on Russia has significantly waned in recent years, thanks to the expansion of commercial spaceflight, with SpaceX now serving as the space agency's primary carrier. The current ISS agreement involving 5 space agencies expires in 2024. So far, Russia's Roscosmos has yet to extend its role. In a statement to NBC News, NASA says it continues working with all our international partners.
And earlier this month, a trio of Russian cosmonauts made headlines when they showed up, Joe, at the International Space Station with yellow and blue on their spacesuits. Yellow and blue, of course, the colors of the Ukrainian flag, but the Russian Space Agency says there's no connection to Ukraine. Joe.
All right. Sam, thank you so much. Let's take a look at what's making news on this planet this morning.
Claudio Lavanga is back with us this hour. Hey, Claudio.
Hey, good morning, guys. Once again, well, on Tuesday, 8 United Nations peacekeepers died in a helicopter crash in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They were on a reconnaissance mission over an area where the Congolese military and a rebel group had been fighting in recent days. The military says that it was the rebel group that shot down that helicopter, but the United Nations say that they are not sure what caused the crash yet and that an investigation is underway. And Senegal beat Egypt last night and claimed the spot for the Soccer World Cup in Qatar later this year. But the Egyptians say their team was penalized by racist abuse and intimidation before and during the game. The Egyptian Soccer Authority said that the crowd threw bottles and rocks at the team during the warm-up and that their bus was assaulted. And Egyptian fans also complained that Mohamed Salah, Egypt's most important player by far, missed a penalty at the end of the game, a crucial penalty, because he was distracted by a laser beam shown from the stand. And last but not least, a woman in Britain found a treasure chest while cleaning up a beach. The woman, a secretary at the local hospital, said she spotted a piece of wood that had an unusual shape to it. Well, it turned out to be a treasure chest from the Victorian era, filled with coins, gems, a bottle of perfume, and even a pocket watch. Well, guys, I also cleaned up a beach in the past, but all I could find were cigarette butts.
Yeah,
not from the
I
Victorian
just
era,
went on a beach
but I'm sure
cleanup.
that in a few hundred years they'll be worth something.
I just did that for a story coming up, and nothing like that.
No, she didn't need a pirate ship either. So.
Very, very cool. Claudio, thank you so much. Now, staying overseas, Queen Elizabeth made her first public appearance since her COVID diagnosis to attend Prince Philip's memorial service at Westminster Abbey. Roughly 1,800 guests were in attendance to honor the late Duke's memory, a stark difference from his funeral service nearly a year ago. NBC News correspondent Kathy Park joins us now from Buckingham Palace with more on the service. Hey, Kathy, good morning.
Hey, Savannah, good morning to you. Yeah, just hours before this service, it was still unclear if the Queen would attend, but she did, as you mentioned, along with 1,800 guests. And she definitely turned some heads when she was escorted to her seat by her son, Prince Andrew.
Queen Elizabeth making a grand entrance and returning to Westminster Abbey for Prince Philip's memorial service. Her first public appearance in months, escorted by her second son, Prince Andrew, who recently settled a sexual abuse lawsuit in the U.S.
There are lots of different theories swirling around about what that message was, whether there was a message. One theory is that this was the Queen giving her stamp of approval to her disgraced son.
Despite concerns about the Queen's health and mobility after canceling past engagements, the 95-year-old rallied to pay tribute to her late husband in the same place they got married more than 70 years ago. She stood throughout the service, singing and praying, at one point appearing tearful.
I think a lot of Brits really found it quite an emotional scene, quite an emotional thing to be seeing, and a relief that she was able to carry out this duty.
But a conspicuous no-show on Tuesday, Prince Harry, who stayed in America but will travel to the Invictus Games in April.
People are wondering how many more big occasions like this are we going to see the Queen at.
But this week, Britain's longest reigning monarch back in the spotlight, showing the world her deep devotion to her prince.
And the Queen does have more public events before her big Platinum Jubilee celebrations in June. But royal experts are saying don't be surprised if she shares some of her responsibilities with her son, Prince Charles, the future king, because of her health and age. Savannah, back to you.
Absolutely. All right, Kathy Park, thanks so much. And coming up on Morning News Now, the very latest on the fallout surrounding the smack heard around the world and the consequences Will Smith could face from the Academy.
We could soon learn what consequences, if any, Will Smith could face after slapping Chris Rock at the Oscars. The Academy's Board of Governors is expected to meet soon and discuss a possible punishment. NBC News national correspondent Miguel Almaguer has the latest.
Will Smith has already apologized, not just to Chris Rock, but everybody who was watching the Oscars. Now it's the folks who run the Oscars' turn to weigh in.
This morning, the group at the helm of the Oscars facing a critical decision. The Board of Governors, set to soon meet, is still reviewing the slap seen and heard around the world.
Oh, wow!
The powerful committee of over 50 members has the authority to sanction or suspend Will Smith's membership. They can even revoke his Oscar for the attack on Chris Rock. But even Harvey Weinstein and Roman Polanski kept their awards despite being kicked out of the Academy.
Security here tonight is tighter than some of the faces.
Former host Whoopi Goldberg is a board member.
Let me say this, there are consequences. Yeah. There are big consequences.
After the shocking moment played out in front of a live television audience of over 16 million Americans, 16 million more began viewing what happened online in a social media sensation. Jada Pinkett Smith posting Tuesday, "This is a season for healing." She was the target of Rock's joke.
Jada, I love you. G.I. Jane 2, can't wait to see it.
And had openly discussed her struggles with hair loss less than 2 weeks ago.
I don't give two craps what people feel about this bald head of mine, because guess what? I love it.
After Will Smith apologized Monday night, calling his behavior unacceptable and inexcusable, Chris Rock has yet to make any public comment. This week in Boston, he's kicking off a series of sold-out shows, his ticket sales exploding after the Center Stage saga. And now in the spotlight, a podcast Rock recorded earlier this year explaining that after a violent childhood fight, he resisted confrontation.
As my shrink puts it to me, you have been scared to be angry ever since.
Today, all eyes back on the comedian and what he'll say next.
Y'all gotta see it. It's really good.
One of the Oscar hosts, Amy Schumer, is now also speaking out about the event. She said she was stunned and shocked and said Will Smith must be in so much pain. Back to you.
Miguel, thank you so much. Time for our CNBC Money Minute, the biggest financial headlines of the day and why they matter to you.
Silvana Henao is back with us. Hey, Silvana.
Hey guys, good morning. Home prices in January skyrocketed more than 19% compared to January of 2021. This as the inventory of homes for sale dropped to a record low. That's according to the S&P CoreLogic Case-Shiller Home Price Index, which measures average home prices in major metropolitan areas across the country. Arizona and Florida saw huge surges in home prices. The index showed the biggest annual gains in Phoenix, Tampa, and Miami. Home prices are surging as demand for homes strongly outpaces the supply of homes for sale, and competition leads to bidding wars with many homes selling above their list price. Lululemon CEO Calvin McDonald said the company will start raising prices on about 10% of its styles in the second quarter amid ongoing supply chain challenges. McDonald announced the price increases on the company's first quarter earnings call Tuesday after Lululemon reported stronger sales and profits to start 2022, despite the Omicron variant weighing on its business. Lululemon added that its increased use of air freight as a way to avoid some supply chain issues, and that weighed on the company's profits in the first quarter. Formula One's drivers are preparing to ask for more input on where races are held in the future after a missile flew into an oil depot in Saudi Arabia last Friday, just 7 miles from the track hosting the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix a couple days later. After emergency meetings long into the night on Friday, the weekend continued and world champion Max Verstappen won Sunday's race. Some drivers, however, did not want to continue with the race. Sky Sports News reports drivers are scheduled to have meetings this week with F1 bosses and get more detail on the attack and security measures around the Grand Prix, guys.
Yeah, we were all waiting to see if the race was actually going to happen. It was quite something, yeah. All right, Silvana, thank you.
You got it.
It's becoming more challenging for people trying to buy homes. Mortgage rates are high, and so are home prices. Costs of a home jumped more in January than analysts expected, and it's been rising ever since. CNBC real estate correspondent Diana Olick shows us how it's all impacting home buyers.
Lauren Poi almost bought a home in Dallas 2 years ago, but decided to wait.
Now just kind of having buyer's regret of not getting into it then, just seeing how much the market has gone up. So definitely have had to adjust my budget a lot.
After cooling off a little for the last 4 months, home prices are reheating yet again, even as mortgage rates rise. In Dallas, prices were up 27% in January from a year ago, and it didn't even make the top 3. Take a look at Phoenix, Miami, and Tampa. The smallest gains were in D.C., Minneapolis, and Chicago, but they were still in the double digits. Mortgage rates began to climb in January. The average rate on the 30-year fix started the month around 3.25% and ended January at 3.68%, according to Mortgage News Daily. It's now flirting with 5%.
The HOAs are $376 a month.
But Dallas real estate agent Kelly McMahon says rates still are not cutting into demand.
I will say I have had more cash buyers this year than I've ever had, and they're borrowing from parents. They're just finding that cash because they know that it's more competitive with cash offers. Because the rates have gone up, they are just trying everything they can just to be competitive.
And part of being competitive, according to Lauren Poi, is being ready to bid it up.
You have to look at it knowing you're probably going to have to offer like $40K over asking price.
While rising rates don't seem to be cutting into prices just yet, they are hitting sales, which have fallen for 4 straight months. Prices usually lag sales by about 6 months, but this is a very unique market because of the historic housing shortage. A lot of buyers may be priced out, but those still in seem to be willing to pay up. Back to you.
Diana, thank you. If you've got spring break or summer vacation plans, there's a good chance your airport experience will look a little different. Many airports are undergoing major renovations. This morning, NBC News correspondent Tom Costello has an exclusive look at Delta's new terminal at LAX.
Yeah, good day. There are major airport upgrades happening on both coasts and in the heartland. And as you know, some of these airports look like they've been stuck in the 70s or 80s. This is Delta Airlines' brand new terminal here at LAX, set to open next month. But airports across the country are spending billions of dollars to improve your travel experience. Spring break and a notoriously beat-up Los Angeles International is looking like one massive construction project. New bridges, new parking, new terminals, a new tram system coming soon.
Passengers for Delta Flight 1393.
Now, Delta Airlines is preparing to open a brand new LAX terminal, just as Americans are putting the pandemic behind them and catching a flight to anywhere. Delta's CEO says, don't expect an empty middle seat.
We'll see this month probably the strongest sales we have ever seen. Ever. Yeah, it's a massive amount of sales coming in the door.
Delta took advantage of the pandemic slowdown to speed up its LAX construction project. New ticket counters and kiosks, 14 new TSA lanes, a brand new concourse coming soon, and new baggage sorting systems. And a big upgrade for anybody with club access, an outside deck, a retractable roof, a bar. And look at the view, the runway, Hollywood, Beverly Hills, and Bel Air. LA Airport CEO Justin Urbacci. First impressions matter for a city, right?
Absolutely. The airport is the first impression and the last impression that people get when they come to a city.
LAX is just one of many airport facelifts and redesigns nationwide. Seattle's SeaTac, overhauling its central terminal, International Hall, and concourses. Denver International, upgrading the Great Hall, new check-ins, TSA checkpoints, and expanded concourses. And all 3 Big Apple airports. A new Terminal A at Newark and an eventual air tram replacement. A new International Terminal 1 at JFK Airport. And big upgrades to Terminals 4, 6, and 8. Perhaps the most needed and biggest airport overhaul, New York's LaGuardia Airport. A brand new Terminal B for American, Southwest, JetBlue, and United, while Delta gets a new Terminal C. Economists say airports that don't upgrade risk losing billions of investment dollars for their cities and regions. Is this something customers are demanding? Do they want a better travel experience, a better airport experience?
Well, they deserve a better airport experience. And by the way, so do our employees who have to work here all day long.
So I asked CEO Bastian, why are ticket prices suddenly surging, up 40% across all carriers in just the last few weeks? He said several things are happening. Jet fuel prices much more expensive because oil is up because of the war. In addition to that, we're seeing a surge in passengers coming back to airlines. And the airlines, all of them are simply not offering as many seats as they did before the pandemic. So it's supply and demand. Back to you.
All right, Tom Costello, thank you so much. We got breaking news this hour. Senator Susan Collins, Republican of Maine, says she will vote to confirm Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Yeah, this is big news because she's the first Senate Republican to support Judge Jackson's bid for the high court. In a statement, Collins described the confirmation process as, quote, broken, adding the role of the Senate should be to examine the qualifications of a nominee, not, quote, assess whether a nominee reflects the ideology of an individual senator.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.